when Arif and I were talking about potential subjects, something that I really wanted to explore was this notion of a Commonwealth effect on trade, a Commonwealth advantage. Back in the mid-1990s, one started to get ideas of this floated in terms of the new Commonwealth. It was seized upon by David Howell when he chaired the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report on the future of the Commonwealth in 1996. And when the Blair government came to power in 1997, Robin Cook took this up, and we can now actually see, because of the move of government towards a 20-year rule on government papers, we can see the cabinet papers from 1997 with Robin Cook really bigging up the idea that the Commonwealth Summit in Edinburgh was above all for Britain a chance to promote trade. We've seen figures banded about since then suggesting a measurable advantage in terms of a greater propensity of Commonwealth states to trade with each other as bilateral partners. A figure of 20% more trade is sometimes used. And one also comes across this figure of 19% lower costs when trading between Commonwealth countries. But it strikes me that it would be really fascinating to dig into those figures and see how robust they are. And of course, post-Brexit for Britain at the moment, this is more than an academic issue. The question of how far the Commonwealth could or should be looked upon as something that might replace trade with our continental neighbours, of course, is more urgent than ever. So this is a really important gathering. We have an outstanding panel of experts, and so we should be able to, one way or another, get some clear and definitive answers, or at least some clear and definitive questions. But thank you all for coming and taking part. And let me hand over to Arif now to introduce our speakers.
So greetings and welcome on a sunny London day, and great to have you with us, although we haven't got the pleasure of walking into Russell Square or green sites there. We can virtually connect, and so we're delighted to have you with us. And Philip's laid the canvas very clearly. So I'm a research student at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, but I've also been involved in Commonwealth organisations for a number of years. Mainly private sector based organizations. We will come on to that a little bit later when we talk about other things through this afternoon. So I just want to build on what Philip was saying by highlighting this this development really in the last 3 or 4 years, not just in the discussions on trade. So kind of the discussions have been kind of progressing. There's been research that's been undertaken. We're going to look at that. But I think in parallel with that, we've seen the kind of evolution of business networks in the Commonwealth, the most prominent of which has been originally the Commonwealth Business Council, which then transitioned, I think is probably one way of putting it, to then its current existence as the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council. But in parallel with the networks, there's also been governments and the private sector coming together. There have been 2 meetings which have brought trade ministers together, and I've often thought that they're probably the hardest ministerial people to get into a room at any one time, because they're always usually on an airplane going somewhere. But they have met twice in London with respectable turnouts on both occasions. So there's been that momentum, but also, and we've highlighted some of the links to some of the earlier work in research. There's been the original work on the Commonwealth Effect was done in 1997 by Sarianna, Lundan and Geoffrey Jones, who are leading researchers in the international business research and academic arena. Geoffrey Jones now at Harvard, and Sarianna, who's the editor of the Journal of international business policy based here in Europe. And then we have the Commonwealth Advantage, kind of economic advantage, has now entered the lexicon, as Philip has mentioned. I mean, it's certainly now being cited regularly by ministers. Certainly the UK government during its term as chair of office has often cited it as one of the benefits of being in the Commonwealth, and one of the important factors that command our attention, not least given the changed economic circumstances that the UK has had, initially from Brexit, but now increasingly with the pandemic, and also with the growth and development of markets, high growth markets in places in Asia and Africa, propelled by a more positive demographic scenario than perhaps is the case in developed markets, particularly in Europe and North America. So that's been part of the canvas. But also, I mean, the last thing I just wanted to say was we've also tried to bring together a group of people today to kind of lay out the canvas of this perspective on trade. So we have people who are more involved, been involved more on the policy side, on the research side, working with the Commonwealth Secretariat, both in the past and currently. We have people who are been very heavily involved in the Commonwealth academic community through the Commonwealth Research Network and international business, some of the work that they've been exposed to and indeed have been driving themselves as well. We've also had, I think, one person who's not able to join us is Daniel Hatton from the Commonwealth Fashion Council, but I'm wearing a tie today, and my wife will be the first to put me in fashion, not in the same sentence, but I will say something briefly about Commonwealth fashion and just highlight really some interesting work that they've been doing at the end of the comments this afternoon. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A and discussion as well. We are planning on recording, well, this session is being recorded, and I think we have agreement from all the speakers this will be made available afterwards on the YouTube School of Advanced Studies channel, so you'll be able to catch it later as well. But I'm delighted to welcome a group of people here today. I'm going to invite the first person to open up the proceedings is Dr. Mohammad Razak, who I've known for a number of years and has really played a pivotal role in the Commonwealth's work in the 10 or 11 years in which he was there. Not only did he see, I mean, you can tell us, Razak, I think you were there through no less than 3 Secretary Generals, from what I recall. I think Don McKinnon and Kamla Sharma, and then Patricia Scotland. So you've seen a period of significant change in that time in terms of some of the work the Commonwealth has done, but also how the world has evolved, you know, in trading terms. In fact, the very first description, I think the strapline for the Commonwealth Trade Reviews, which were instigated, was the changing trade landscape. So Dr. Mohammad Razak, former advisor and head of the International Trade Policy section of the Commonwealth Secretariat, currently research director of the Policy Research Institute in Dhaka, but today in London. So there you are, Richard. All roads lead to London today, and we're all in London town. So Razak, delighted to have you with us, and a warm welcome, and over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Arif, for that very generous introduction. I would also like to thank Professor Philip Murphy for letting me make some kind of remarks or my views on the issues that we're discussing here today. Arif, you kindly provided me with some kind of hints, like that I should be using in making these remarks. So I've divided your initial kind of guidance into 3 pieces. One is the original rationale for the Commonwealth Effect or the Commonwealth work that I saw in the Commonwealth Secretariat, and also I got involved into this. That's number 1. Number 2, I would also like to shed some light on the methodological approach that we used in coming up with the Commonwealth Effect or some of the terminologies that you have mentioned. And the final thing that I would also like to shed light on is the wider reflection on the use of the word either Commonwealth Effect or jargon, the Commonwealth Effect or Commonwealth Advantage in public discourse. So those really. So with regard to original rationale, Arif, you rightly pointed out, I had the opportunity of working or serving 3 Commonwealth Secretary General, and to be honest, I was extremely privileged, to be able to work for a section, particularly within the Secretariat, that was dynamic and that did a lot of work and continues to do a really good work, and I can say this now because I'm outside the Secretariat now, and I can value the work, that the trade division or the section is currently undertaking as well. Now, I was first introduced to the Commonwealth work while I was finishing my PhD at Sussex. My supervisor was Professor Alan Winters, who later on became the chief economist as well. So as I was finishing my thesis, Professor Winters sent me to the Secretariat to meet the then head of trade section. And they asked me to do some work for them. So that's how my initial, interaction with them took place, I think, in 2001. But of course, then I finished my PhD and went back to Bangladesh and taught at Dhaka University for several years. But in the meantime, I would keep in touch with the Secretariat, and the Secretariat would commission, certain pieces of work, and would ask me to do a number of things, for them. But then eventually, I was fortunate enough to get a full-time employment in the Secretariat in the beginning of 2007. Now, immediately, from my previous interactions, and as I took over, the role of economic advisor in the Economic Affairs Division, one thing became quite clear to me was this. In a way, the Secretariat was sitting or had a kind of an uncomfortable sitting when it comes to international trade work. It was doing a lot of work. For example, it was helping African countries or the Pacific countries negotiating the IPA agreements. If I do know, there's a big work going on in Geneva and also elsewhere within the Commonwealth countries. So big work was going on. And many other work, considering country economic perspectives and dealing with the trade challenges. But one thing the Commonwealth Secretariat was shy about working is promoting the trade between Commonwealth members. No. So the whole idea was the trade relationships within the Commonwealth member countries were guided by individual Commonwealth members, say, being member of different regional platforms, like, SAFTA in South Asia, maybe UK and Cyprus, UK, Malta under, for example, European Union. Canada had NAFTA and other things. So the Commonwealth Secretariat was of the view that it was so difficult to have policy-induced mechanism that would promote intra-Commonwealth trade or trade between members. So that is why they were a bit shy, working on this. Then in 2009, there will be CHOGM at Port of Spain, or if you would recall. And as part of that, then the Secretariat commissioned a study to the renowned trade economist, Professor Chris Milner. He was at the time was with the Nottingham University. So he then did some work in understanding the trade potential in the Commonwealth, and particularly how the Commonwealth countries, they can harness the trade opportunities that might arise. However, the conclusion that came from the study was something like this, was the Commonwealth countries are geographically pretty diverse, and the distance between them can be very high. For example, if you think about 5 growth centers within the Commonwealth, UK, Canada, South Africa, India, and sorry, did I leave another country? And Australia. And if you take the average distance of these 5 growth centers with individual Commonwealth members, then that distance will be 9,500. And one thing the economists are very scared of when it comes to international trade is the cost of trading, and which is distance is a determining factor of that. So in a way, that particular study also found out that it might be a good idea for Commonwealth members to go for, say, unilateral trade liberalization or undertaking trade facilitation measures. That will promote general trade, and through which the trade between Commonwealth members should also increase. That was the kind of recommendation provided in those studies. However, in other platforms, particularly you have mentioned about Lundan and Jones study. That was a good study to begin with, that showed that there is some kind of phenomena where Commonwealth countries tend to trade more between themselves than others. So that is one issue. But also at the same time, the RCS, the Royal Commonwealth Society, as you know, they were doing some work in terms of promoting intra-Commonwealth trade, but also Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council. They were also quite proactive in those days, promoting trade between Commonwealth members. So there was a bit of a dilemma in the Secretariat, like what we can achieve for our members, in expanding trade amongst themselves. Just because in the Secretariat there is a strong view that since Commonwealth is not a trading bloc, since there is no Commonwealth-wide FTA, there cannot be any policy mechanism for promoting that trade. So that was a kind of dilemma for us. And then in 2015, then there would be the Malta CHOGM. And before that, 1 year before that, it was decided there is going to be a flagship publication on international trade. The Secretary reviewed its situation and found out that on trade, it was working a number of things. And to be honest, it was really a big pillar of the Secretariat's work. So they decided to have a regular flagship publication on trade. And I was then asked to come up with a flagship publication on trade, the first one. And in that, as part of that exercise, then we'll start exploring further into this. And particularly, at the time, my director and I, were of the view that there will have to be something that the members will consider precious. They will think that even for CHOGM, there could be one interesting dimension would be promoting intra-Commonwealth trade. And I was personally very much encouraged by the work that is being done by the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council, because they were promoting this intra-Commonwealth trade. So as part of that, then we started working on the to find out if there is any genuine Commonwealth effect, or whether we can estimate that the trade between Commonwealth countries, that propensity is higher than the Commonwealth countries trade with other non-Commonwealth member countries. Okay. So that's what. But to be honest, Arif, it was not a academically speaking, it was not that we were skeptical that we won't get that effect. This is because in the established academic literature, there was a well-established empirical results that would show the colonial effect was so prominent in promoting trade even today. But they did not use the word Commonwealth because, they also had, they also tried to understand the impact within the, say, Francophone countries. But in general, in those models and empirical work, they will always have a kind of variable saying that whether the members of previous colonial linkages, and thereby they will try to find out whether that particular variable is significant. And in that regard, the gravity model was used quite regularly, and the results were always that almost in all cases you will find that colonial effect was positive when it comes to international trade. We knew this, so we are a bit more confident that our results will also be quite similar to that. However, when in 2015, when we started doing this trade flagship publication, one advantage that we had, the literature, it is called the gravity modeling literature of international trade, which is considered to be, the gravity model is considered to be one of the most successful model in predicting trade flows between members. It was such a discipline. and extremely successful. And that particular discipline developed a lot, and some of the empirical methodology and the data set were pretty, well established. So we took advantage of the methodological advancement that took place, over the past decade or so. And we used the data. By the time the data were available, remember in London and Jones, they handpicked, I think, 18 non-Commonwealth countries, and then they compared them with 53 Commonwealth members to come up with the results. But in 2015, we had the luxury of kind of including all countries in the world. So we had something like 200 plus countries and much longer time series data over the past 2 decades or so. Okay, so that we could make use of. And we found, so in a way, just my brief response to Professor Murphy's question, we found that impact was pretty robust and I'm more comfortable saying that, is in line with what has already been established in the literature. In the literature, academic literature, it was being called the colony effect. In here, we said the Commonwealth effect, and we isolated the Commonwealth countries from the Francophone countries, just to find out what is true for British Commonwealth countries. And those estimates, as has been pointed out, 25% in the case of goods trade. But in my view, the effect was more robust for intra-Commonwealth investment flows, where we found out that statistically, in my view, the results were far more robust. So that was the more kind of history. But also in 2015, the other international development that we could take advantage of was a unique data set that came from the World Bank and UN ESCAP based in Bangkok. So what they did, I just don't want to go into the technical issues, but the thing is this, what they did, they reverse engineered the gravity model and would come up with something called trade cost. So from their data set, we should be able to obtain bilateral trade cost between two countries. Now, that trade cost is estimated in a manner that would kind of consider all different kind of costs that even we cannot foresee. So everything will be kind of come under that estimate. And these bilateral trade costs would come directly from the World Bank and UNESCO data set. So we use the data set, and we did some estimate between Commonwealth members and between Commonwealth and non-Commonwealth members. And when he did so, we found out that on average, Commonwealth to Commonwealth countries' bilateral trade cost is 19 percentage points lower than Commonwealth to non-Commonwealth countries' bilateral trade cost. And that's how this 19% number came out. Now, having said that, we did our work based on international data that is publicly available. And that is why I think we're a bit more confident about the results that we reported. And I'm sure subsequent trade reports as well, they have updated those estimates and more or less found the similar kind of result. But just to conclude on this particular issue, Arif, very recently there has been an article published in Journal of Economic Growth. It's a very outstanding journal in the discipline. And there, the authors, this article was published in February 2021, I guess. And in that article, the authors, they have used 5,000 years of data. So what they're doing, they're trying to find out if the past colonial linkages will have impact on trade flows of today. And the results are quite startling. They find there is positive and significant impact. And just because you are the part of that legacy, that will let you import on average 55% more for another Commonwealth member country. Not Commonwealth, like a part of your colonial establishment. So that's the results they're finding. So that's what I'm saying. These results are pretty robust. So that's what. Now let me deal with the last issue, which is essentially the public discourse. So one is the academic thing, and the way we explain the results in the academic context. We say that, okay, controlling for everything, two Commonwealth countries or Commonwealth members, they tend to trade more. This does not mean that all Commonwealth countries are doing so, right? That doesn't mean so. It's on average kind of thing. But normally in the public discourse, that sometimes gets lost. So that's one issue. The second thing is, within that empirical framework, you could also find out the countries that are trading more within the Commonwealth. I'm now talking about within the Commonwealth member countries. So within the Commonwealth member countries, there are 54 member countries. Some countries are trading more within the Commonwealth than others. And unfortunately, UK is an under trader within the Commonwealth. And it can be explained by the fact that UK's past membership with the European Union, and also the fact that the Europe is close to the UK, and they are quite natural trading partners for the United Kingdom. But sometimes it gets sort of misinterpreted the way it is meant in the Commonwealth Effect. Now, Arif, you will see that in the 2015 report, we had all through used the word Commonwealth Effect. It is just kind of an empirical result. So we said there is this Commonwealth dummy variable in econometricians language. We find that impact is positive and significant, so we called it Commonwealth Effect. But in the run up to CHOGM 2015, and when the press got involved asking questions, so then that discussion was something like, when you are a member of the Commonwealth, perhaps you're not doing anything to promote your bilateral trade, but just because of your past linkages, the language in English and the common rules and regulations, it is a kind of an advantage for us to, and that should lead us expand trade between Commonwealth members. So eventually that got into Commonwealth Advantage, and the current Secretary General, when she took over, I think she I would say popularized the word Commonwealth Advantage. So that is a bit of an evolution of Commonwealth Effect to Commonwealth Advantage. That way I have seen this. Now, there were also other awkward situations, because in the during the Brexit debate, there was both abuse and use of the word Commonwealth Advantage or Effect. Sometimes, some of the diehard Brexiters, they would say that Commonwealth can actually replace Europe in terms of UK's trade relationship. That was not true. But at the same time, the argument that actually UK could trade more within the Commonwealth, that was also lost, just because, pro-European Union, they wouldn't, buy that argument at all, which is essentially a positive argument, that hasn't got anything to do about the political, side that you are taking on the Brexit debate. So during the Brexit debate as well, this, issue of Commonwealth Effect and Advantage, was pretty, I would say, badly used, and there was not much, informed debate by what is meant by, Commonwealth Effect and Advantage. So, sorry, Arif, probably I have taken much more than that I wanted to take, but I thought, that was my understanding and my experience, working with the Commonwealth Secretary, and that way I have seen the evaluation taking. So thank you so much. I will be happy to take any questions or any issues that you may raise. Thank you.
No, Razak, that was a tour de force, and really very important in laying out, I think, the genealogy, if I can put it that way, to the kind of, this initial work in this area, and also how it came about and how it built on other work, and indeed, how it's been reflected in other spaces. But I think, as you rightly say, then of course it gets fed into the Commonwealth machinery, the Commonwealth meetings. And then I think something that you didn't perhaps talk too much about, but I hope we can pick up in the discussion, or maybe others may be able to comment on it, perhaps even Richard, actually, maybe you'll be saying this anyway, how it's fed into the narrative. Because the narrative is actually what's really interesting. What is the story now? What is the Commonwealth story? Is it an economic story? Is it a sports story? Is it a celebrity story? I mean, when we think, is it a royalty story? And this is the, this is part of, when people think about the Commonwealth, what is it that comes into their mind? And I think what's interesting, I mean, particularly for me, and I would just leave, just leave this in the air to be picked up by others, is this point at which the diaspora, particularly now with second generation diaspora, their engagement with the Commonwealth is perhaps quite is quite different from multiple ways. I mean, not just because of the obvious, perhaps with Black Lives Matter and the sort of the fresh focus on identity that clearly has highlighted, but I mean also the fact that I remember in our days at the Commonwealth Business Council, we had a program on the South Asia, Razak, you remember it, the South Asia Trade and Investment Network, and part of that was at a time when there was a lot of linkages being made in the South Asia region between India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. And one of the ideas behind that, this was in about 2007, was engagement of the diaspora. Well, of course, 13 years later, that diaspora demographic is more connected, is better educated. There are still challenges there. So I think that's another dimension to maybe think on. But thank you, Razak, for laying out that really important canvas and really picking up on what you were talking about in terms of research. One of the people that's been particularly active in recent years and in the area of the leading academic space for international business, the Academy of International Business, in fact, serves on the Lundan, on the UK and Ireland committee of the Academy of International Business, but is also very actively involved the University of Leeds, where he heads up the India and South Asia Business Centre or Centre of Management. Has certainly also been very involved in the Commonwealth Research Network on international business. You'll remember, Razak, when you were at the Commonwealth Secretariat, we initiated that as a tripartite initiative from academia, from policymakers, and at that time the Commonwealth Business Council, to try and bridge this dialogue. But I know that, Sarianna, you've been particularly active in not only in engaging with people in the Academy of International Business who are interested in doing research and encouraging them in that direction, but also some of your own research with Professor Peter Buckley in particular around the Commonwealth Effect. Well, in fact, looking more specifically about its work on country alliances, the Commonwealth Effect on country alliances in reducing the transaction costs of internationalization. And I know that that's a great opportunity to hear from you about that, but also your broader observations in interacting with people in the academic policy space on the Commonwealth and international business. Dr. Manjal, over to you. A warm welcome. Surrender over to you. I think if you unmute yourself, a warm welcome to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Arif. Thanks for your kind introduction. So let me say by who am I and what sort of philosophy that I have into my research, which informs my actions. So as Arif was saying, that I am an associate professor of international business at University of Leeds with over more than 2 decades of experience of research, much of which is in international business. And right from day one, when I started working in international business discipline, focus has been always on Commonwealth, for obvious reasons that I come from one of the Commonwealth country, namely India. So having joined University of Leeds, right from day one in this center called James E. Lynch India and South Asia Business Center, where I was a research associate to start with. And I'm talking about 2007, 2008 kind of time period. And then eventually progressing on to take over the directorship of the center. That was in 2013. So again, over 7 to 8 years of leadership in that center has actually given me a space to work on this particular sphere, which is very close to my heart, as I was saying. And at least 2 or 3 different big research projects that we have already undertaken and successfully executed informs that there is a very strong advantage of Commonwealth to its member states. Even though Commonwealth is not an economic bloc, as Razak was was talking about in the past. But and it has its foundation in terms of promoting democracy among its member countries. But what we essentially see is that even though this is not an economic bloc, the very fundamental undercurrent, which is about bringing in democracy and promoting institutions. So the institutional arrangements within the Commonwealth country actually provides a strong reasons for doing business. And when I say that, in terms of the advantage, what I mean is, even though the Commonwealth countries are spread across the globe, starting from small islands in Pacific until Canada in the West, from north to south as well. But what and Razak was talking about these distances, so over 9,000 miles on an average distance between these five. He was saying about these 5 major growth hubs. That's absolutely right, and all that leads to higher transaction costs, because the distance is high. That means the transaction costs are likely to be high, either in terms of shipping goods or in terms of moving people or whatever. So we understand that these transaction cost issues do exist, but we still wanted to see how far the commonalities in institutions would have an impact on the trade and investment relationships that Commonwealth countries would have among themselves in comparison to countries which are not part of the Commonwealth, right? So you could argue that country A can transact with country B or country C. There's a choice, and one country is outside its group and the other country is within its group, and therefore it would always have a choice, and the choices would be obviously determined by the transaction costs that it has to incur, or the players who are doing international business. I mean the businesses or multinational corporations, those who are undertaking investments and global trade, would have a choice whether they go to a non-Commonwealth country or they go to a Commonwealth country. So with that sort of preposition, when we did economic modeling, what we find, what we find is the theoretical relationship is that higher the distance, more the transaction costs. And if I'm talking about these distances, distances can be of many types. We can talk about geographic distance. We can talk about economic distance. The economic distance means the distance in the economic policy, the differences among the economic policies, for example. We can talk about the administrative distance, and we can also talk about the cultural distance. So a lot of distances do exist. And in academics, we have got indices to measure these distances. So when we did the empirical modeling, what we found that distances on their own would have a negative relationship with trade and investment, which is very much a theoretical relationship that we understand. But when we bring in the element of Commonwealth membership, and here what we find is an interesting twist, which is that those negative relationships with distance turned out to lose their negative coefficients or negative sign and the significance when they are interacted with the Commonwealth membership. So what in a sense it means is that the impact of these transaction cost, distance related transaction cost, tend to disappear when countries trade and invest, when countries are involved in Commonwealth relationship. The trade and investments, the negative effect of these distances on trade and investments is mitigated. So that was a very interesting and fundamental finding, and that was in many ways informing, or what we read in Sarianna, Lundan, and Geoffrey Jones' work about Commonwealth Advantage, is that why does that actually happens? So why does that would actually happen? It would happen so that advantage would eventually emerge because the transaction costs will be lowered, right? So that was one of the major research project that we had undertaken, and that work eventually got published in Cambridge Journal of Economics in 2017. So that's a peer-reviewed, high-profile academic journal which vouches for the authenticity of the validity of the methods that we are employing, and the secondary database that we had used, and these theoretical relationships that we were proposing. So that was one thing that we found. Now, before I talk about my own other work, which talks about the value chain, and this is the current project which is now going on, before I talk about that, let me emphasize on the other colleagues that are doing research on similar type of themes. One of them is Professor Keith Glaister. Professor Keith Glaister did a work recently that was published in a journal called Management International Review, and he very specifically looked at the investments, the foreign direct investments getting into African countries. And as Razak was saying, yes, we are talking about Francophone countries, Lettophone countries, and Anglophone countries. So all countries in Africa region were modeled on the basis of the foreign direct investments that these countries have been receiving over the last 30, 40 years. And he has made a very interesting comparison. And this comparison is between the countries who were part of British Empire in the past. So these are Commonwealth countries against other countries which are not part of the Commonwealth. And what he has found is that the impact of the Commonwealth is much more stronger. So in terms of the investments received by African countries from its colonial master, so we are talking about Britain here, is much more stronger when it is compared with the other European colonizers. So that again, to a large extent, explains that the relationships among Commonwealth countries have been very robust. And this is a very latest study published last year itself, informing about the value, for example, that the Commonwealth hold in terms of its trade and investment opportunities. Well, things have been changing. We understand now UK is out of the European Union, and to a large extent, its sovereignty is back in terms of where it wants to strike it trade deals and put in the tariff and non-tariff related barriers for promoting or not promoting trade and investments, and with whom. So now let me just move on towards the other research project that is now underway, and it is about the global value chain. So Razak was talking about these 5 major hubs. I would say, yes, these are the 5 major growth hubs, but I would count them as 7, not just 5. So I'm now adding Bangladesh itself and Nigeria. One can talk about other countries for sure, but at least I would say that there are 7 major economic hubs within Commonwealth countries. And if you see the geographic locations, again, they are spread across the globe. So we are talking about Australia in Far East, and then we are talking about Bangladesh, India in somewhere in the middle. We are talking about Nigeria. We are also talking about Canada, for example. So anyway, so the point out here is that they are geographically spread. That's their geographic distribution. But if you look at their economic distribution, there we have countries which are highly advanced economically. We have countries which are very less advanced, and countries which are which are at the ladder of growing very rapidly, like India and Bangladesh. So that economic configuration has a value. And if you look at their natural resource endowment and the technological assets that they own, again, there is a wide disparity. And is that disparity a bad thing or is it a good thing? So from a business perspective, my thinking has been, or my propositions have been, that if you look at the industrial configuration, for many industries, this is rather a good thing. So for example, if you talk about the textile industry, you need hubs where the production can be undertaken at a low value. If you talk about automotive industry, you need countries which are advanced in terms of producing technology. Pharmaceutical industry, again, we need countries which are much more advanced in research and development, and the countries which are large in terms of its population, which signifies that there is a market. So if we try and look at some of these industries on the basis of these diversities, on economic basis, or on technological basis, or on geographical diversity, natural resources, as I was saying, you will find that there is a case for some kind of intra-Commonwealth trade, which means it is not just buying and selling relationship, but processing the goods right from its raw material stage until the final goods, right? That whole production chain, the value chain of that product, can be successfully undertaken within Commonwealth countries. So production can take place here and can also be consumed within these countries, which means that there is a proposition about Commonwealth value chain or intra-Commonwealth trade that can actually facilitate that. So this is one of the research project that's which is underway at our end, and we have made applications to the UK government as well as to the Indian government, trying to seek funding in order to find support for collect it and find support for these industries where these propositions may apply. So I don't know how I'm doing in terms of the time, but probably I would like to stop out here and take up questions if there are any, because if you are trying to talk about all these details, they will definitely take a very long time. So I would rather stop here. Thanks, Arif.
Thank you very much, Surinder. And that's been, again, very helpful to highlight the work that you've been doing at Leeds over quite a sustained period. I mean, there is a question that has been entered in the chat. I mean, I'm not sure, you covered quite a lot in what you were saying. Just because we've got, other comments that now be coming in, it'll add to the discussions already. You may just want to very quickly respond to this question, which links to your point on distance, which Razak also talked about. The question, which just for the benefit of all, it talks about the article about the benefits of Commonwealth membership, negating the disadvantage of distance-related costs. And the question was really about trying to understand how just being a member of a Commonwealth, this is the perception of what you were saying, the Commonwealth, by being a member of the Commonwealth Trade, the transaction costs are lowered regardless of distance. Was that what you were saying, or do you want to further clarify your...
Okay. Yeah, so I just saw that question here again. So, okay, let me give you a small example. Think of the movement. So I'm talking about geographic distance now. So geographic distance is pretty much fixed, right? We're not thinking about the movement of tectonic plates and therefore countries coming together. And even if they're coming together, there will be probably a few millimeters over many years. Okay, so we are talking about these geographic distance which are pretty much constant. Okay, and which means that there will be an X amount of cost that you will have to incur if you are moving people or if you are moving goods. Now, think about a country which has no relationship, two countries which has got no relationship, and therefore the movement of goods and people is not really facilitated as such because there is no such association between those two countries. Now, against that, if you think about two countries which have got some kind of collaboration going on, which does mean that there would be mechanisms through which movement of goods or people is being facilitated. So now I'm talking about Commonwealth and taking very specific example of, let us say, moving people, right? We understand about diaspora, we understand about all these events that take place, which means that the traffic movement, either you talk about goods or people, has been facilitated. So the impact of those higher traffic volume would be that the average cost I'm talking about of moving things and people between two countries would be lower. So that's about geographic distance. Let me take another example about cultural distance. Now we are talking about two countries which have got no cultural exchange going on between them, against that the Commonwealth countries which have got a lot of cultural exchange that takes place. We are talking about games. Arif was talking, is it a game block? We are talking about the exchange of artists. We are talking about exchange of students and a lot of other things that goes on. Now, what happens as a result of this cultural exchange is that there is a lot of understanding, cultural intelligence, knowledge exchange that take place. So what does it do? It reduces the impact of cultural distance. So the transaction costs that are associated with the cultural distance would be lower. Now I'm just for the sake of fun, trying to give you an anecdote. There was a dinner. I was sitting with one of my colleague who is a British, and said that it's a Britisher who could actually tell you whether this is an authentic Indian curry or not, right? What I was actually trying and understand is that a British would really understand what is an authentic Indian curry, right? So that's about the cultural intelligence. And where does it come from? It comes from these cultural exchanges. And what does it mean? That a Britisher may not really need somebody, he will not need, or she will not need somebody who, or need to hire somebody who would actually tell them that this thing is authentic. They could do it, that evaluation by themselves. So the transaction costs associated with that cultural distance would be lower because there has been an understanding of culture. So I think that's what I mean. And I'm more than happy to share that paper with you. So you would get a lot of other examples as well as the explanations that would explain why these costs will go down.
Thank you very much, Surinder. And I think it's fascinating in your response, but also as you were speaking, it's the last session we held about a month ago was on the African Free Trade Agreement. Again, I know, Richard's an area that you're also very interested in the potential of Africa. And there was a very stimulating set of discussions around the creative industries, which is part of what you're talking about. But also, I think, as you've been speaking just now, we talk about distance, but of course, as we've learned only too readily in the last 12 months, technology is upending our traditional definitions of what industries can do with distance and not do. So there's clearly a movement on that front. Let me just turn. We've had two great contributions from Razak, from his work in research and policy, and from Surinder, from his work at Leeds, and in the Academy of International Business with the various, and also I think the broader engagement with researchers within Commonwealth countries, in India, Australia, and in different spaces in the Academy of International Business. But I think now I want to turn a little bit more to the sort of the business experience. And I think, Richard, you bring huge perspective to that. I know that you've lived and worked in, I think it's 60 plus, I think is the figure of countries around of the globe, and from your British Council experience. But it's certainly when you became the chief executive of the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council, it was clearly a seminal moment in the sense that it was obviously in the lead up to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting being hosted in London. There was also, I think, significant movement in sort of the way the business was changing, not just with technology, but also new industry sectors emerging, artificial intelligence. We sometimes forget, the rapid growth and development in the last just few short years in this. but also, and I remember very well the meeting that I know you were very heavily involved in bringing together with the trade ministers, the first trade ministers meeting. And I thought what was so striking about that was it wasn't just the fact that it was a meeting in London, but the way that the business community was brought into a dialogue with them, you know, sort of a series of those roundtable discussions that you had. And I thought that was fascinating because, you know, it's not just, you know, a government engagement, but actually broadening into that debate with the private sector. And that brings us right up to date with your current role, your chief executive of the London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And I know that there's been for those of you who aren't aware, there has been in the past a Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce, I think for 50 plus years at one point in its earlier incarnation. But I think, Richard, we're very warm welcome to you today. And, you know, from both your past perspective, but your current perspective, where you know, looking out from London into the world really and beyond, very much welcome your thoughts and perspectives today, Richard.
Thank you, Arif. And this is the point where I do apologise that after the intellectual high ground of surrender and Razak, this is now going to come crashing to the earth for the next 10 minutes, I'm afraid, because it's me and I'm not an academic, and I look at it very much from the sort of delivery end of this. I've got sort of 4 things I want to talk about in terms of the Commonwealth Advantage, and they are not, can I say that I hope they're stimulating because they're my personal views. That doesn't mean to say other parts are not advantageous. I'm still fascinated by this really complex issue of why is it cheaper for Commonwealth country businesses in Commonwealth countries to do business with each other. It is, but I still can't get my head around it. But these are 4 things which I think are which have a huge impact on potential on the Commonwealth, providing we in business can get our heads around it. And then I just want to say something about world cities at the end and the emergence of world cities. So my 4 things where I think Commonwealth has advantage are this. The number 1 is we are now in an increasingly fractured world. It's not just calling it multipolar would be to oversimplify the situation, because the way in which we are fractured is different in trade, the way we're fractured culturally, the way we are fractured in terms of access to huge resources, the way we are fractured in terms of defense and security. So we are in a really very, very broken world. It is in trade terms increasingly bilateral. I mean, in the time it took us to fail to negotiate the Doha round, we managed to negotiate over 190 different bilateral trade agreements around the world, none of which used a standard formula. And I want to come on to that in relation to the Commonwealth. All of them were different. All of them have been built up from first principles, even the bizarre agreement between Britain and the European Union. When there was a trade agreement, it was called the single market. Even with that, we managed to construct something from ground zero, pretty ineptly, but it is what it is. And so that fracturing is made more complex by an increasingly diverse spread of languages and dialects, if you like, in terms of trade regulation and management and promotion. I think the Commonwealth has an advantage here because basically trade agreements between Commonwealth countries, while they might be built from ground zero, and they shouldn't be, my view is that the Commonwealth Secretariat should be producing a standard template for trade agreements between Commonwealth countries, which they can build on, they can alter, but at least it would have the same format. People would look at it and say, that's an intra-Commonwealth trade agreement. I know what we're dealing with here. I know the issues it will deal with. It will be clear at what point in the documents and how they're dealt with. I know where to go. That would be hugely advantageous. But the reason that would be possible, that template, is because I think the basic dialogue on trade between Commonwealth countries operates in the same language, even though it's been broken by Britain joining the European Union in the early 70s and by lots of other ASEAN appearing, all this sort of stuff. There is still a common language in there. And I think that's a huge potential Commonwealth advantage. but we've got to grasp it, and it's a role, frankly, for the Secretariat. Second area I think is interesting is interoperability. And this is a military term. It's something when I was running Wilton Park for the Foreign Office, we used to talk about a lot, was interoperability. And it expanded from the military, which means that, frankly, in NATO, you can, every country will have its own preferred weapon, but it takes the same bullets. So if you are in NATO, as my son discovered on his tour in Afghanistan, he basically ran out of bullets, and his Macedonian colleague in the next shell hole was able to throw him a round of bullets because they fitted. But I think there is something more than that, I think, for the Commonwealth. I think there is an interoperability in the Commonwealth, and I think that is largely, a lot of it is around the rule of law. And as we move into, I think, a phase where the world becomes more fractured, it becomes more and more of interest to Commonwealth businesses to basically have their contracts based on mediation and arbitration and not on legal processes in one country or another. So the use of commercial mediators and arbitrators is far cheaper than going to the courts. And what the Commonwealth can do is produce circumstances, and it already has, it's ingrained in Commonwealth judges. And Commonwealth judges have this dreadful propensity to tell companies to get on with their contract and to really be quite adverse to intervening in contractual obligations. So I think that there's a legal interoperability, but there's also the interoperability of language, which we know is there, and I think just gets stronger. I think there's an interoperability in terms of education. There should be a greater interoperability in terms of standards. One of the big things that came out of CHOGM in London was the creation of the Commonwealth Standards Project. And I haven't heard much about that, but common standards around the Commonwealth. And then the other thing about all of that encourages supply chains. I want to say something about supply chains again in a minute, because it's about transaction. But there is, if you have an interoperable Commonwealth, then it means that supply chains become a lot easier to run and a lot easier to manage. And as a consequence of that, I think that's where there are cost savings. There's certainly savings in terms of brain ache. The third area is standards in a different sense. We are increasingly in our world, or the endpoint consumer is increasingly aware of characteristics of goods and services, which are, if you like, express the values under which those goods were constructed or put together, or the services were delivered. And that's largely around ESG, environmental, social, and good governance issues. But it also deals with things which, if you like, are pre-ESG. So, for instance, modern slavery, blood diamonds, abuse of artisanal labour, and then the four great, we used to say in Wilton Park, the four great organised crimes of the world, which is international wildlife trade, falsified medicines, illegal drugs, and human trafficking, of which human trafficking and falsified medicines are the most profitable because, of course, you sell the product in plain sight. But I think there is something within the Commonwealth over ESG, which enables us, because of supply chain coherence, because of the interoperability of supply chains, should enable Commonwealth businesses trading, being part of each other's supply chains, to actually be much clearer about ESG qualities and values associated with products and services, and therefore make them more acceptable to endpoint consumers. And then the fourth area, and you mentioned it at one point, Arif, in terms of diaspora, is diversity. And again, I think this is somewhere where the Commonwealth has failed. It has got a huge opportunity that comes from the diversity of the Commonwealth. And our history means that we have significant diasporas between our countries. But what we have failed to do is engage with inclusion. So we have, if you like, the building blocks, but we haven't really done anything with it. Building blocks is diversity. The doing something is inclusion. And certainly in London, I look at London, which has it does basically have a community for every nation on earth. There are 193 formal national communities in London. Around a third of London was not born in the United Kingdom, which is the closest the official Office of National Statistics come to telling if somebody is actually genuinely from outside. And that includes me. I was born in Hong Kong. We have not made, we've got this huge diversity in London. We talk about it all the time, but we have failed to be inclusive. And certainly one of the things I'm doing at the moment is trying to figure out ways in which we as the London Chamber of Commerce can be one of the catalyzing agents for inclusiveness in business in London. So I think inclusiveness is an unused benefit of the Commonwealth, and it needs to do something about it. I don't know how it does something about it, but it needs to start doing, because it's just a wasted opportunity, and it should enable us to get ahead of the game with other countries who are equally non-inclusive and don't have the opportunity, don't have the diversity to enable inclusiveness to be a major force in terms of trade and commerce. I suppose in all of this, we're talking in one way about transaction costs, but I think maybe the Commonwealth should be thinking much more about transactional risk and transactional complexity. Both risk and complexity is growing hugely, and they have an impact on cost. And that's maybe where the Commonwealth Advantage occurs in cost, is because risk and complexity increases, which therefore immediately increases the cost. So anything you can do to reduce risk and to create a greater simplicity reduces cost as well. Final thing, I just want to say something about world cities. And this is again where the Commonwealth doesn't have a unique advantage, but could well do. The nature of a world city is that it is not simply a subset of the economy of the country where it happens to be. It is also a significant part of the economy of other countries, to the extent that when I lived in Nigeria, I think I told you a bit before we came on air, when I lived in Nigeria, the old joke was, what's the second largest city in Nigeria? And of course, it's London. Because in many ways, part of this, a cultural thing, and certainly Lagosians treat London as though it's and treat the plane as though it's a bus. You just get on it, go and do your business, and you wouldn't think any more about it than you would about getting on the tube. So I think there is something culturally about that, but there is also something, you know, about the economies of countries. London plays as significant a role probably in many ways in the economy of Nigeria as it does directly in the economy of the UK. Now, I don't know whether that is, I've said something there which rigorous research would prove me wrong, but that's my challenge. That's my null hypothesis. But I think we now have to look at where are the true world cities in the Commonwealth, and how can they work more effectively together, not treat each other as competitors, but as analogues and collaborators. And secondly, how can their power and their influence be more dispersed more effectively throughout the Commonwealth? And I think those cities need to come together, and certainly the London Chamber of Commerce, once we're allowed to do things that we barely remember, like going abroad, we will be working on. And to my mind, the 5 principal world cities are genuine in their own league in the Commonwealth are London, Lagos, Mumbai, Singapore, and Sydney. And I think I would I'll be challenged on this, I know. I can't see a world city emerging in South Africa yet. Certainly cities of significance in relation to the continent of Africa, but I can't see them as world cities yet. They just don't have that ecosystem. But one which I think is starting to emerge, the one I would keep my eye on, is Dakar. That's my, if you're looking for me for a tip, if you're going to go down to the bookies and put a tip on the next world city for the Commonwealth, a Dakar, £5 either way is worth betting on. Arif, I think I've waffled on enough, haven't I?
No, that's great. I mean, no, Richard, that's very clear, very characteristically very clear and very focused. And I think the interoperability point. I mean, you mentioned, actually almost really passing, but I mean, you highlight a really great example. It took, I don't know how many years it took the International Standards Organization to get to whatever it is, how many 100+ members.
Yeah.
And it took the Commonwealth, less than 2 years to get to 52, whatever it was, and that itself, at a time when there's so much else going on, that itself must send out a message, in getting standards. And I think that's, and I remember, a bit like you, actually, I remember having this conversation with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and said, look, why don't you just take that fact and focus on that, because that's such a powerful piece. And of course, it's got lost in translation, and it kind of gets buried in. Ministers scarce even refer to it, really, but it is a really powerful example of exactly the point, because standards, obviously permeate everything, and for business it's a real cost, and it's a real example. And I think also the interesting point on standards, I think, Richard, and you reference it, is the way they're developed, as you know, because you're part of it. The private sector is part of that conversation, is part of the process in the working with government and other stakeholders and the research community. That's the model that is used globally, and the British Standards Institute is one of the leading players in that space. And I think it's a really important example. I think the other point that you make about, diversity. Yes, I think I may have mentioned to you, my PhD is on diaspora networks in the Commonwealth, so I might well come back to you in 18 months and ask for or show you my research question, and you tell me whether it makes sense or not. But I think the point is absolutely there. It is something that governments haven't really grasped, and I don't think clearly not just from the UK but other countries as well. I think it was very interesting, and you remember, Richard, at the London CHOGM there were a set of reports done on diaspora investment. As well. So this is clearly an area that is taxing minds, but they haven't really got the answers yet there. But I think, the examples which you gave, absolutely very real. And I think, and Dhaka, I don't know, Razak might want to come back to you when we have broader discussion on Dhaka, since he lives part of his life there. But see, he's now the global citizen, Razak. You're in between the two world cities of Dhaka and London. You're a walking example of what Richard's talking about. But Richard, no, thank you very much for that. That's been a really helpful perspective that you brought in, and also drawing upon direct experience. And I think that's what's so interesting this afternoon. We've got people who've been directly involved in this area, either in terms of research or policy, or in terms of business or experience. I'm just going to turn next to Radhika Kumar, who's with the Commonwealth Secretariat at the present time. In fact, our previous ceremony we held a month ago, which was with Razak's successor, who I think, Razak, you recruited in, Dr. Brendan Vickers, who was an alumnus from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies as well. But Radhika, very pleased to have you with us today. So Radhika is based at the Commonwealth Secretariat and advisor in infrastructure policy in the Trade, Oceans and Natural Resources Directorate, and has really been at the heart of, very involved in particularly this initiative, the Commonwealth Trade Connectivity Agenda. In fact, it's not actually called, Richard, it's not called the Trade Connectivity Agenda, but that's what it is. It's called the Connectivity Agenda, but it is, really about the trade connectivity. And Radhika, you've been involved in that. That's what you've been very involved in how that's developed. But also, I think, again, going back to what I was saying about the story, you've also been critically involved in bringing the different stakeholders together in these Commonwealth cluster weeks, of which I think there have been 3 now. And I think what's really interesting, I know, Richard, you and I were in one of the first ones, there is this outreach. I don't think it's got there yet, but there's certainly a direction of travel that they're trying to engage with the business community, not just through the sort of the obvious players, if you like the Commonwealth Enterprise Investment Council, but also regional trading communities as well, business trading communities, whether it's COMESA in Africa or others like SARC in South Asia. So Radhika, warm welcome to you. And I know that you have a few opening remarks to make, and then we have a short video to play, which brings, I think we need a bit of video on a long afternoon of hearing a lot of voices. But let's have Radhika, a very warm welcome to you to this afternoon, Radhika, Dr. Radhika Kumar. From the university. In fact, this is another, see, we have, Richard, the diversity on the panel. We have someone from a PhD from the Pacific, as well as from as well as from the UK. So we have walking examples of Commonwealth intellectual talent in front of us. Radhika, warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Arif, and thank you for the introduction. much has already been said by, I think, others. And so it really makes my work presentation even easier now. Just to highlight what Dr. Razak had mentioned and what Professor Manjul has also mentioned in terms of the empirical work, but what I'm trying to now reflect on is basically whatever their findings are in terms of the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda. It basically links to the policy and more on the practical side of things. And so basically I'll be very extremely brief in terms of just explaining the rationale, the potential, and what's in it for the Commonwealth in terms of the CCA. Well, this agenda, of course, was endorsed by the Commonwealth Heads of Government in 2018 with the view to increase Commonwealth trade and investment by $2 trillion by 2030. So how we planned to actually go about working towards this vision was basically there are 5 clusters, namely the physical connectivity cluster that deals with digital infrastructure and digital divide. We have got the digital connectivity cluster, which works on trade and digital trade policy. Then we have the regulatory connectivity, which looks at issues surrounding enabling environment and good regulatory practices. The supply side cluster looks more at the sectoral level of things, such as digital fisheries and digital agriculture, and more importantly, there's a link to the private sector as well through the business to business connectivity cluster. So in relation to the progress, each of the clusters are member driven, and it has got a pan-Commonwealth approach in relation to consensus building, which is now, which I would say is again linked to alliances. And as a result, I believe that's how maybe trade costs and what Professor Manjul has mentioned about his paper, that the significant level of the trade cost had reduced significantly. One of the maybe the co-factors would have been the alliance, the consensus building, and the trust factor amongst the Commonwealth member states that makes them more comfortable in trading regardless of the actual cost. And perhaps this would be an area of further research as well by the universities. And also I would just while reflecting, while all the discussions were happening, I would also like to maybe urge if further research would be done on how the Commonwealth Advantage would now change in terms of the digitalization and the digital maturity level of the Commonwealth member states, because every Commonwealth member state is at a different level. The hubs may be more advanced than the smaller, say, Pacific region. So based on the digital maturity, will there be a positive change in the Commonwealth Advantage, or would there be a negative change, and what would be the pathway to achieving more intra-Commonwealth trade? And also this, with this pandemic and COVID-19, of course, and Brexit, these are maybe new areas of research that needs to be looked into. And just coming further on the CCA, so basically we have the clusters come, we had 3 Commonwealth Connectivity and Agenda meetings, and then different issues have been discussed. And the most important thing, again, in terms of this alliance and consensus building, is that the outcomes of the CCA is then reported to the senior trade officials meeting and also to the Commonwealth Trade Ministers meeting. So in terms of the Commonwealth Advantage, the decision that is taken is at the highest level. And so there is also this aspect of the strong political will. Of course, the Secretariat also has the convening powers to organize these meetings. And as Secretariat, we facilitate these meetings. So, and then finally, through the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda and the link to Commonwealth Advantage, I'd say that if we look at other multilateral organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, when decisions are made, it is more legally binding, and sometimes it takes time to reach an agreement on a particular issue for that matter. But this CCA, it provides that space for member countries to discuss issues and also forge alliance on issues of mutual interest without having that sense of committing legally at that point in time. So it's something which differentiates this the CCA or the trade connectivity agenda from other maybe forums as well. So I do not want to say too much because we have got a video which actually explains everything in detail. So I would just request Arif if you could play the video. Thank you.
Sure, yes, I'll just play that. And just to mention, as you mentioned, those clusters, one of the things I think was very striking is your regulatory cluster. And I think, Richard, it picks up on what you were saying about business, because, you know, the opportunity for business, for regulators across the Commonwealth to compare notes on how they're doing in terms of regulatory barriers is something that I remember, Radhika, you remember when you presented on that, or you in the Commonwealth team, we had the UNCTAD were coming and looking at that and saying, we wish we had something quite like that. So I think there is certainly, you know, value in that sort of benchmarking, which you're doing electronically now of different countries in this area. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play world premiere, no less, of this short piece on the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda. So I'm just going to share screen and then go straight into here. Let me reduce that and just check you can hear the sound as it starts.
Your commitment.
Could you hear that? SG beginning to speak.
To the Commonwealth.
Radhika, could you hear that while I was playing it?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just go back to the beginning and play it. Here we go.
Your commitment to the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda is of tremendous value for all our member nations. You are carrying forward an implementation and delivery, an important outcome of the 2018 Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The purpose of the agenda is to boost trade and investment links among Commonwealth member countries with the goal of increasing intra-Commonwealth trade to $2 trillion by 2030. On the way to achieving that long-term goal, some essential preparatory work has already been undertaken. Towards fulfilment of the mandate given to us at CHOGM by the leaders of the 53 governments we serve, Commonwealth Secretariat technical specialists have been working with member countries to implement the pilot phase. It is being made operational through 5 Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda clusters. That's the business to business, digital, physical, regulatory, and supply side. Since being launched in January, all clusters have made impressive progress, with 75 institutions participating and representing 35 member countries. Such commitment and collaboration are most commendable, particularly at this time when multilateralism seems increasingly to be threatened. Your collective efforts and cooperation demonstrate the exemplary ability of the Commonwealth to make pioneering progress, including on some of the thornier issues besetting trade at present. It is particularly valuable to have case studies prepared by policymakers which identify and draw together examples of policy success and best practice that have been refined and honed through experience in a range of contexts. Having been collated, these can be disseminated and used beneficially by policymakers in other Commonwealth jurisdictions and more widely. So it is immensely encouraging that during your time together, you will be developing further your collective understanding in mutual areas of interest, including digital transformation, digital infrastructure, smart agriculture, and good regulatory practices. Our Commonwealth approach acknowledges and welcomes the transformational contribution the private sector can make to the connectivity agenda process, particularly in relation to the economic empowerment of women and youth. You bring such dedication, and the combined specialist knowledge represented in the clusters is deeply impressive. I thank each and every one of you for all that you are contributing in so many ways towards deep and enduring Commonwealth impact. So thank you, each and every one of you.
I think this is a really unique opportunity given the Commonwealth's membership is so diverse, from Pacific Islands to developed countries to developing countries, to really get them together to discuss their very different perspectives on these very important agendas, one of which, of course, is part of this cluster weekly, which is the digital economy agenda, which many countries are speaking about. I think the Commonwealth Secretariat members are similar to the SCAP member states in that in our membership we have some of the most innovative countries in the world, but also some of the most technologically deprived. And if our platforms are to work and genuinely leave no one behind, which is a core principle of the SEG, these platforms are incredibly valuable.
So we have been having core discussions to look at public-private dialogue and how to ensure that we can strengthen inclusiveness of the business community and the business community agendas within the dialogues of the highest levels of the presidents within the Commonwealth Summit, the CHOGM that's taking place next year. The Commonwealth Secretariat's biggest advantage in my view is the convening power. The fact that you could actually bring together so many industry players and advocacy bodies in one room to discuss and understand and have a cohesive narrative towards a common vision and a common goal is very, very key for us. And that's a very, very strong suit for the Commonwealth Secretariat itself.
Working with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the various members of the Commonwealth countries who are here, this is opening up opportunities not only for Vanuatu but for all other countries to actually collaborate on various aspects of business and government operations. Digital connectivity is exceptionally important. Vanuatu being a very small archipelago of 83 countries in the South Pacific, reasonably isolated. We are a least developed country, developing next year from that into a developed status. And what this allows us to do is communicate and collaborate with other countries and look at options for trade, security and various other aspects of economic and business development.
So I've been involved in the regulatory cluster since kind of its inception and planning the first meeting and what we were going to look at. And really we were hoping to just kind of get regulation and good regulatory practice on the agenda of the Commonwealth and come together to collectively talk about what are the issues facing the Commonwealth. The regulatory connectivity cluster is basically looking at two different elements. So one is good regulatory practice, and that basically means the best practice rules for making regulations. So impact assessments and ex post evaluation and consultation, transparency, all of those principles. So how can you embed those across your policymakers and government to create regulation which is proportionate and going to be effective on the ground. And the second element is also looking at how different regulatory metrics can have an impact on business on the ground. So things like access to electricity, access to finance, broadband speeds, digital connectivity, and seeing how regulation can be a blocker or a stimulus to that, and how learning from different countries and economies about how they've implemented different initiatives to overcome those and help to really boost and support businesses.
If you look at Bangladesh, which is moving ahead very fast in last couple of years with a GDP growth rate of 6%, and last year we had a GDP growth rate of 7.86%. So basically we are looking for wider engagement with the different parts of the world. We want to have better market access in the member countries of the Commonwealth. So from today's perspective, I mean, connectivity is one of the most important issue. Unless and until you have this kind of connectivity, it is not possible to, I mean, engage with the business of other country. So we are very much hopeful that outcome of this week and the decisions that we will be taking here, I know that will be placed before the trade ministerial meeting. So we will come up with some kind of definite plan of action to move forward.
It was a true expression of the rich diversity and color of the Commonwealth when 500 participants from 22 Commonwealth countries gathered in Malaysia for a conference on women in the digital economy and international trade. The Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Wan Aziz Wan Ismail, opened the conference and launched the Commonwealth Connectivity Agenda for Trade and Investment. She reiterated the Commonwealth's commitment to making trade and investment more inclusive by encouraging women in business and breaking down gender-based barriers in all economic sectors. After the launch, businesswomen shared the challenges they face in trading their products locally and globally, which included access to financing, markets, and technology. They gave recommendations that should be included in the connectivity agenda to tackle these issues, which will enable women producers and exporters to secure resources they need to grow their businesses properly. Delegates welcomed the connectivity agenda, which they said came at a crucial time to help women benefit as equal to men. The Commonwealth will present the findings of the conference at the next cluster meeting on digital and physical connectivity in South Africa.
First cluster group meeting for the Commonwealth member countries that focuses on micro, small, medium enterprise. At this meeting, we were looking at value addition and crop plantation. Another important factor that was also raised quite a number of times is the issue of climate change and how it has also affected in some of the Commonwealth member countries in the Pacific, particularly, and also to some degree in Africa and Caribbean.
Vanuatu is made up of 83 islands, and the majority of our population lives in the rural area, and they live on subsistence farming. And I think this workshop today will be able to raise this population to the next level in the technologies for value addition, the increase on the supply for us to be able to meet the standards regionally and internationally. So it is important that we as a government give priority to see our industries, small farmers in particular, to produce enough, not only to supply the local markets, but also the international markets.
I believe the Commonwealth Secretariat, as it's already doing, can foster engagements between governments and the private sector to improve digital connectivity among member states. And this will know well for both SMEs in those countries and the governments as a whole. The meeting on digital clusters and physical connectivity is important because it has highlighted issues that member countries are facing to achieve a certain level of digital connectivity, especially as most member states are least developed and most of the populations are in rural communities. Digital connectivity will help improve the lives of rural people and also ensure that people across the world are connected to enhance trade.
Right, so I'm just going to close that, and I'm just going to pass the meeting, as I've still got control of the screen. I'm just going to thank Radhika for those comments, and I'm just going to very briefly, I mean, we're almost at time, but we'll have time for some discussion, no more than 5 minutes, say something very briefly about fashion. So Daniel Hatton, who's the CEO and founder of the Commonwealth Fashion Council, hasn't been able to join us, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. The first is this initiative on Made in the Commonwealth, which is about supporting intra-Commonwealth trade and values-based business collaboration in the Commonwealth, and a number of initiatives there supporting rural communities as well. But I think the other thing I wanted to highlight, one of their programs, one of the Commonwealth organizations, is the work that they've been doing on sustainable fashion. So I'm just going to just play you this for, it's only about 2 or 3 minutes. Let's have a listen to this.
You've mentioned fish skin, people go, does it smell? Is it fishy? You know, so people want to really get sort of tangible with the fish skin, which is fantastic because that offers a sort of different dynamic to have that conversation with. But the response from the fashion designers was one really positive, and the reason for that is because the actual fabric, the actual fish skin itself, looks and feels luxury. So with that itself, you know, it offers designers and fashion houses the confidence that they can actually create a sellable and luxury product. I've seen a added value element, really, and that comes through education, and it comes through empowerment, and it comes through the education by retraining people within the fishery industry on how to remove the fish skin and treat the hide immediately after it being removed, and how to treat it in the right solutions and the right dyes too. So you've got that added value in terms of education, but also you've got the values of empowerment, where you're going into communities that are located around the fisheries, and you're giving them jobs, and also you're encouraging them to you know, gain better education and understanding, not just of fashion, but sustainable and responsible fashion.
Right, so I'll stop sharing there. Yeah, so thank you very much to all of the panel, in fact, to Radhika. And I mean, that last piece really picking up on an area perhaps which we may want to explore a little bit more in the questions. I saw there was a question there, I think, from Nicholas Watts, one of the other team here at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, on tourism, but I mean also on the impact on tourism, and is there a tourism advantage in the Commonwealth? But I think also in terms of fisheries as well, and sustainability and sustainable fashion. An interesting example of common interest there, and from the perspective of trade, but also something perhaps that hadn't been talked about that much was the impact of climate change, and the extent to which climate change, and certainly Richard, you'll be very well aware that the broader business engagement on climate change and how that can have a significant impact on disruption for supply chains, but also how business needs to work much more collaboratively in this context. And of course, the Commonwealth provides one mechanism to do that because of the existing relationships that are in place. So we have time for questions, about 15 or so minutes, not perhaps as long as we would have liked, but over to you. We're a smaller group as well, but if people want to make any comments or questions, the floor is open. I mean, Nicholas, I saw your question earlier about tourism. Do you want to, I mean, you asked it very clearly in the chat, but do you want to sort of elaborate on that a little bit, or restate it?
Thank you, Arif. If I can see, well, yes, I'm just thinking about the impact that COVID has had on tourism, and I wonder if there is information or if you have data on the intra-Commonwealth tourism benefit. I work with the Commonwealth Association of Museums sometimes, and I wonder if people go to Commonwealth countries from, say, Canada or from the ABC countries, to learn in part about Commonwealth history and imperial history, and is there a Commonwealth advantage that might help recovery of the tourism sector? I suppose that's the basic question. I appreciate your points on fisheries, by the way, and climate change. And just this has come to me today, the FAO publication on the impact of disasters and crises on agriculture and food security. I'd commend that as a report. I just don't know where the Commonwealth sits in terms of the impact of natural disasters and impact of climate change, drought and floods and so on. But that's another issue. The Commonwealth disadvantage, perhaps, in Africa and small island states.
Thanks very much, Richard. I mean, just as a footnote to that, I mean, you'll be particularly aware, we're having this conversation just earlier this week, I think in the CHOGM themes that we're just waiting to get some clarity on. I mean, we understand sustainability and trade has all been put together, so perhaps that's another way where these issues will be fleshed out. I mean, some of you talked about tourism. I mean, obviously, Richard, tourism is London's lifeblood in a sense, but of course has been, you know, it's one of its biggest casualties in terms of not just the tourism sector, but the ancillary sectors, of course, around that. But tourism is also changing. I mean, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think tourism is changing. And I think Remember, London is in an interesting position. Its tourism bolsters the ecosystem of the city as a working city, and equally, the working city bolsters tourism. So they are both very, very closely related. One of the things I am worried about is talent. And I think this is a Commonwealth vulnerability. Talent in the creative industries, particularly associated with tourism, and I would include that, Nicholas, museums and talent associated with museums. If people lose their jobs, there is very little else they can do with that range of skills. And so the problem is they will then move to another sector, probably have their entire confidence blown out, because you have to say, if you're going to be an actor or a museum curator, you have to have probably committed yourself against family advice to do it. Your confidence has gone, you move to another sector, you get another job, and you probably stay there because you think, I have been bruised by this experience, I'm not going back. And what worries me about tourism is so much of it revolves around specialist people who could just be forced to go into another sector and they will never return, and therefore the quality of that tourism sector declines.
I mean, and we know, I don't know, what is it, Richard or Razak? I mean, something like, is it 40% of revenue in some of these Caribbean countries comes from tourism, something as high as that? I mean, it's...
Well, actually, not just revenue, GDP.
GDP, I should say, yes, sorry, GDP, yeah.
You know, you can't cope with that sort of loss. I mean, that is catastrophic, that fall in GDP.
Yeah.
Particularly because then you have the other consequences. Then the people who were earning that GDP then become a burden on the other part, the part of the GDP that continues to work.
Yeah.
So indebtedness then goes through the roof.
Yeah. Razak, do you want to come in on that, on the services? I know that's been often ongoing discussion in meetings when you were at the Commonwealth Secretariat and also with Radhika in terms of the services sector and how that's evolving. We talk about the service, it's a terrible word, the servicification of the economy, but how economies are becoming more service orientated, and what that means for Commonwealth trade.
Yeah, as I already responded, to that particular issue of tourism, because one way of looking into it, through the services trade, and I would like to assure you is that when you talk about the Commonwealth Effect, that work empirically has also been undertaken in the context of the services trade and also investment. And there also we find strong effect. But I agree with Richard that, of course, the Commonwealth countries have been severely hit because of the COVID-19 consequences. And we know that tourism is a sector that has perhaps been, worse hit. But as the recovery, takes place, I tend to think that because of the connections and the Commonwealth Effect that we have been discussing, the Commonwealth member countries, at least some of the, I would say, the tourism-rich countries, they are going to, take advantage, of that, recovery process, when it begins, definitely. But also, looking ahead, I do say that, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, is this: in investment, the Commonwealth Effect is very strong. So I would also say that there will be new investment taking place, and the upcoming Commonwealth Trade Report has some interesting discussion in that regard. I had the privilege of reviewing the report. It is coming out quite well, and there are some reflections there. The final thing I would like to mention, as Richard has already pointed out, making use of diaspora. If you remember, in the 2015 trade report, we did mention that the diaspora potential has not been utilized at all. This is something the Commonwealth must take advantage of. You say, why the Chinese, they did so well in attracting foreign direct investment? It is the Chinese people, living elsewhere and then investing back into their, country. In the Commonwealth, if you think the Lundan, Richard has talked about the impact it has on Nigeria, but also Bangladesh, I must say. And the Commonwealth countries, they are looking forward to see, if UK and India can have a kind of bilateral trading arrangement, that can have huge spillover effects. Even a country like Bangladesh, it is going to be a $1 trillion economy by 2030. And you imagine the trade linkages it has with the UK. UK is a services-rich economy. Bangladesh is a goods-producing economy. You cannot have better complementarity than promoting this trade. And what a nice way of taking advantage of this situation. Unfortunately, sometimes the policymakers, they are not aware of these things, or they have got other things they prioritize in that way. As Richard has pointed out, we live in multipolar economy. There are a lot of tensions going on, but we need to be mindful of the fact that if we allow those issues to take over us, then the trade gains, the economic gains will always be undermined. So we'd like to have a more kind of I would say rules-based system, and at the same time allow Commonwealth countries through their normal course and then they should always be benefited from all the trade flows, investment, the exchange of ideas, and diaspora linkages. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Sarianna and Radhika may want to come in, and I know that there's no Richard and Sarianna, my PhD on diaspora networks and Commonwealth trade, no pressure on me whatsoever. But I shall I shall replay your words many thousands of times, I'm sure, over the next few weeks and months. But I want to pick up on a question which I think goes also on something that Richard, you picked up on when you talked about, you talked about London, but of course the broader point is region to region linkages. We talked about, and I think that Bala, you have a question that is specific to that. So Bala, who's one of the other research fellows at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, a warm welcome. Dr. Bala Chandra, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, my question is, in this debate about Commonwealth Advantage, we are talking about advantage in terms of nation states, in terms of country-to-country linkages. But with the sustainable development goals and the rise of the importance of local governments and local cities, there is a scope for looking at how cities can link with each other because they, at certain levels, can work autonomously in that sense that their economies or have a slightly different velocity about themselves. So this is a question in a way to Richard, because we talked about London and the trade and the Chamber of Commerce. For the last 2 years, I've been leading a city-to-city link between Canterbury and Entebbe in Uganda. Both are Commonwealth cities. But there is also another aspect to this particular link is we're trying to see the link between at a multi-sectoral level, business or let's say multi-sector level, business, civil society, and the government. So in other words, we had a Zoom conference in which elected politicians from both cities, business people from both business leaders from both cities, and also civil society organizations from both cities met to discuss how they could take it forward in relation to the SDG 17, which is the partnerships aspect of the UN SDGs. So my question is, to what extent can we see a business-to-business dealing or rather link develop between the cities? In my experience, the only place where we've been trying very hard, we have been trying to use the Canterbury Business Improvement District model to develop something similar in Entebbe. So apart from that, if you have any ideas on how we can link at a business-to-business level, but also between cities, but also between business, civil society, and the government sectors. This becomes very important, especially in view of COVID situation. Any response from all the four speakers would be helpful.
I just ask, I think in the interest of time, what I suggest is thank you very much, Bala. We'll certainly take that question. And I'm just having a quick glance at any final comments. Maybe, can I ask, what we'll do is we'll go around to each of the panelists and invite them to respond to that question, or indeed make comments on earlier questions, but also combine that with maybe a closing comment or remark from each of you. So perhaps if we could start with Radhika, and then we'll go through to Sarianna and work back through from there. So Radhika, would you like to comment on this importance of city to region to region linkages, or any of the other points that came up in the discussion earlier, or just come in with a concluding statement? Radhika, you're on mute if you just.
Sorry, so I'll be very brief. First of all, just to touch on the point of that was discussed earlier about tourism. Yes, it is one of the critical sectors for economic growth for many of the Commonwealth member states, in particular the small island states, and not just, I mean, the Caribbean, plus also in the Pacific. So of course, with COVID-19, though, Dr. Razak mentioned that in the when the economy recovers, in the recovery period, the tourism sector might pick up. But then also we have to be also cautious about how long it will take, and also the vaccination effect, taking into account that factor as well. It's more like now vaccination can be have an economic angle to it, meaning a first mover advantage. So if the countries that have the vaccinated population, they will become more attracted in the tourism kind of country vis-a-vis countries that are kind of in the process of vaccinating. So that would be something, I don't know if some analysis have been done, but this is also how the health and the economic sector might interplay in terms of the tourism recovery. And also just, of course, for city to city links, it is important. This is an experience which I would share from my work in the foreign affairs ministry way back in like many years ago. What we used to do is we used to enhance a collaboration between cities. In countries, there would be normally sister city agreements that would be signed with a certain kind of provisions on what between cities, what kinds of assistance could be provided if one city is more developed than the others, and so forth. So perhaps within the Commonwealth, a sister city kind of bilateral agreements could be something which could be explored as a Commonwealth advantage, but this is just a thought. And of course, for Commonwealth advantage, much has been said, so I don't want to repeat myself, but just going forward, I would say that there is more scope in terms of research in relation to looking at the COVID-19, the pandemic, the digital disruption, and how the Commonwealth trade disruptions might look like in future, whether it's positive or negative. And this would be another area of broader research in future as well, including other factors that have been, diaspora and others, but this would be something, which could be looked at by academics as well. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And certainly the upcoming Academy of International Business Conference, which is taking place in London, in fact, although it's virtual, it's at Greenwich. There is a panel on the Commonwealth, on trade in the Commonwealth, to take that forward. But I think, your comments very well taken. And thank you also very much for, for bringing that video as well, which I think laid out very clearly, I think, voices from the field, if you like, from people on the ground in different countries talking about their perspectives on this. Sarianna, to you.
Yeah, so very briefly, I think there was a study that was sponsored by the Commonwealth Secretariat when Razak was one of the chief economists there. He was the one who commissioned that study, and we did that. It was about the Chinese influence on small Commonwealth economies. But one of the elements that we picked up on that study was about tourism. So, and recently, in fact, it was last year itself, one of my student at Leeds did a research on Commonwealth effect on tourism. It was not about the small Commonwealth countries, but in general. So I think what, in nutshell, I will say is that there is a lot of traffic, as I was saying before, in terms of the geographic distance impact and the cultural distance impact, which is mitigated by Commonwealth. So a lot of traffic in terms of tourism comes or is between or intra-Commonwealth countries, and that is significant. Although Chinese tourism over the years have risen quite a lot. And if you isolate that effect, the Chinese tourism effect, the tourism among Commonwealth countries is a very significant traffic, and that is certainly going to pick up again in a post-COVID world.
Yeah. It's a lot of money that's not being spent right now, Richard. It's going to fuel. Is it going to fuel growth or not? But Richard, maybe do you want to come in next in terms of responding to some of those points?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tourism one is an interesting discussion, but you know, there are world cities which don't have any tourism at all. I mean, Lagos being one, which I think is a great regret because there's a lot to see in Lagos, but it doesn't have much of a tourism industry. I'd just like to return to the 4 points I made, which is about you know, is about the fractured world, the interoperability, ESG and non-accounting standards of behaviour and qualities, and then the issue of inclusion. I just don't feel that we've made enough of that in the business community across the Commonwealth. I think we've tended to look at trade simply as a function of people doing deals. And yeah, in the end, that is the underpinning of trade, is businesses doing deals with each other. But I think increasingly it is more than that. The value of trade is actually not simply transactional. And the Commonwealth has a huge opportunity to exploit the non-transactional attributes of trade in terms of the wealth and security it generates.
Yeah, I mean the ESG, the environment, social governance, piece. I mean, it's certainly yes. I remember when Radhika, you'll also recall that the trade ministers met in London, at Marlborough House. I think 90 minutes without interruption, with everybody contributing to the discussion on inclusive and sustainable trade. So it was it really did draw in very, very strong levels of interest. Razak, you started us earlier this afternoon talking about where this all came from and how it grew and developed. Leave closing thoughts to you before I pass back to Philip.
Thank you, Arif. In my concluding remarks, I would like to say that I think now, since the Brexit has happened and that debate is behind us, so it is also, in my view, an opportune moment now to sort of focus on the Commonwealth and see what we can do much more constructively, because then some of the elements that were not very helpful in the past, we can avoid and make the discussion happen. Now, here are the things. I believe the world is changing rapidly. You need to have your policy orientation maybe adjusted towards Asia, which is now the dominating growth hub for the global economy. And this will continue. By 2050, Asia will be a source of more than 50% of world GDP. And for UK, I mean, this is also an opportunity to get engaged initially with the Commonwealth countries. And here I can give you concrete examples. And I would ask Richard, to have this engagement with the London-based business community. You see, or if you would know, Bangladesh and Pakistan now have duty-free market access into China, which is the world's largest, importing nation right now, right? And over the next 10 years, what we are going to see, that import market is going to double. Okay. So now, if the London-based investor, they are investing into Bangladesh and then the goods are being exported to China, I mean, what a win-win situation for the Commonwealth countries. I mentioned about the India-UK, a potential trade arrangement, European Union, they failed to have a trade agreement with India. But I do think, perhaps, UK, because of less bureaucracy involved now, it should be able to, strike one. And that can have positive spillover effects. One concrete example I can give you, and Richard, you are very much well aware of this. This M-Pesa in Kenya, that what an excellent example, where you can build on the technological knowledge that we have in one hand, and then taking the business elsewhere. And within the Commonwealth, Richard, I think I counted once, by 2030, there are going to be at least 22 Commonwealth members with GDP more than 100 billion. And if you look at Bangladesh and Pakistan, of course, India has got a lot of attention already. But even Bangladesh and Pakistan are going to change quite dramatically, over the next decade or so. I mean, if you're not in terms of everything, but just by GDP size, those are going to be enormous, economies. And here are the opportunities for us. So I would think that, the people, who we work on the Commonwealth issues, including us. I think we need to be a bit more proactive as well. But this is an area I honestly believe we all can achieve, truly win-win situation. And that will be good for even the global economy, as I said, because the Commonwealth advantage is such, it is not hurting any other country. We do not have any block. Because when you do a trade block, that means, you are erecting trade barriers for other countries and thereby trying to gain. In the Commonwealth, this advantage has always been with us. It's just all about, our being aware of and find out, the ways and means, through which, we can make use of. Thank you so much.
Zach, thank you very much for that and bringing things together. And I think there's been a very, it's been a very rich discussion, but Philip will now formally close it. But I just want to say from my side, it's been really rich discussion, and it has been recorded, and we'll certainly, share the link with you afterwards. And I'm sure there'll be others who'll be watching it. But thank you all very much for your contribution, and Philip, over to you.
Yeah, and just very, very briefly, thank you from me. It's been a really fascinating discussion, really rich. I think it's great that we have the recording of this, because I think it will be referred to a lot. And best of all, we've managed to end on an upbeat note at a time when Britain's export figures are not looking too good. So I think any thread of optimism we can find in this situation, we should hang on to. But thank you all very much indeed. I hope you'll join us for our next Commonwealth Business Conference in seminar in a few weeks' time.